The wagon wheel sank deeper into the mud with a wet, sucking sound that made Helena Thornton want to scream, but she bit her lip and gripped the reins tighter instead, knowing that losing her composure would not get her out of this mess any faster than the mule could pull her free. It was April of 1873, and the spring rains had turned the roads outside Redding, California, into treacherous rivers of brown sludge that seemed determined to swallow her wagon whole along with everything she owned in this world, which was not much but was everything to her nonetheless. She had been traveling for 3 weeks from Sacramento, making her way north to start fresh after her father's death had left her with nothing but debts, and a wagon full of belongings that creditors had somehow overlooked in their eagerness to claim everything of value from the small apothecary shop he had run for 20 years. The mule brayed in protest as Helena urged it forward again, but the animal had more sense than she did and refused to exhaust itself in a futile effort. She climbed down from the seat, her boots squelching in the mud that came halfway up her calves, and she felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes even as she told herself that crying would accomplish nothing. The afternoon sun beat down on her shoulders through her simple cotton dress, and she could feel sweat trickling down her spine as she moved to the back of the wagon to assess the situation more clearly. Both rear wheels were buried almost to the axle, and she knew with a sinking certainty that she could not free them alone. The road stretched empty in both directions, winding through rolling hills covered in golden grass and scattered oak trees that provided precious little shade. She had not seen another traveler for hours, and the nearest ranch was at least 2 miles back according to the last person she had asked for directions. Helena pressed her hands against the wagon and pushed with all her strength, her feet sliding in the mud as she strained against the impossible weight. But the wagon did not budge even a fraction of an inch. She was catching her breath and considering whether she should unhitch the mule and ride it back to find help when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of Redding. Helena straightened and pushed a strand of dark hair away from her face, leaving a smear of mud across her cheek without realizing it. A rider came into view around the bend, sitting tall in the saddle on a roan horse that picked its way carefully through the muddy patches. As he drew closer, she could see he was a cowboy, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly beneath the brim of his worn hat. He reined in his horse a few feet from her wagon and tipped his hat, his blue eyes taking in the situation with a quick assessing glance that seemed to miss nothing. "Looks like you have got yourself in a predicament, miss," he said, his voice carrying a warm drawl that suggested he had spent most of his life working outdoors under the California sun. "The wheels went in before I realized how deep it was," Helena said, hating how defensive she sounded but unable to help herself. "I have been trying to get it out for the better part of an hour." The cowboy dismounted and walked around the wagon, examining the wheels with the same careful attention he had given the entire scene. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from hard physical work rather than excess, and Helena found herself noticing the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders as he crouched down to look at where the wheels had sunk into the mud. There was something solid and capable about him that made her feel simultaneously relieved and embarrassed at her own helplessness. "Ground is soft all the way through," he said, straightening up and wiping his hands on his pants. "We are going to need to get some leverage under those wheels and give your mule some help from behind. You traveling alone?" "Yes," Helena said, lifting her chin slightly as if daring him to criticize that choice. "I am heading to Redding to start a new life. My father passed away 2 months ago, and there was nothing left for me in Sacramento." Something shifted in the cowboy's expression, a softening around his eyes that suggested he understood loss more intimately than most. "I am sorry for your troubles, miss. My name is Thomas Cooper, and I work at the Circle C Ranch about 5 miles west of here. Let me help you get this wagon free, and then I can make sure you get into town safely." "Helena Thornton," she replied, feeling some of the tension ease from her shoulders at his straightforward offer of assistance. "I would be grateful for any help you can provide." Thomas moved to his horse and untied a coil of rope from his saddle, along with a shovel that he carried back to the wagon. "First thing we need to do is dig out around these wheels so they have room to move," he explained, already dropping to his knees in the mud without any apparent concern for his clothes. "Then we will put some branches under them for traction and use my horse to help pull while you drive the mule forward." Helena watched as he worked, his movements efficient and practiced, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he dug away the thick mud that held her wagon captive. She felt useless standing there, so she hiked up her skirts and knelt beside him, using her hands to scoop away the mud he loosened. He glanced at her with a hint of surprise that quickly transformed into something that might have been respect. "Most ladies would not want to get their hands dirty," he said, tossing aside a shovel full of mud. "Most ladies did not grow up helping their father mix medicines and prepare compounds in an apothecary," Helena replied, feeling the mud squish between her fingers as she worked. "I am no stranger to hard work, Mr. Cooper. Thomas," he said, "and I can see that now. Your father taught you well." They worked in companionable silence for a while, clearing space around the wheels and then gathering fallen branches from the oak trees that lined the road. Thomas laid these carefully under the wheels, creating a makeshift platform that would give the wagon purchase once it started to move. He tied his rope to the front axle, and then secured the other end to his saddle horn, checking the knots twice to ensure they would hold. "When I give the word, you drive that mule forward as hard as you can," Thomas instructed, moving to the back of the wagon where he positioned himself to push. "I will push from here and my horse will pull from the front. With luck, we will get you out in one go." Helena climbed back onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins and preparing herself mentally for the effort ahead. Her heart was beating faster than the situation warranted, and she realized it had nothing to do with the stuck wagon and everything to do with the man who had stopped to help her without asking for anything in return. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. "Ready," Thomas called. "Ready," she confirmed. "Now." Helena slapped the reins against the mule's back and called out sharply, urging the animal forward with every ounce of authority she could muster. The mule leaned into its harness, hooves scrambling for purchase in the slick mud. Behind her, she could hear Thomas grunting with effort as he pushed, and from the front, his horse was pulling steadily, trained to respond to the pressure of the rope. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Helena felt despair rising in her chest like floodwater. Then, with a sucking pop that sounded obscenely loud, the first wheel pulled free. The second followed immediately after, and suddenly the wagon was rolling forward onto more solid ground, and Helena was laughing with relief and surprise as the mule trotted ahead, clearly as pleased to be free as she was. She pulled the mule to a stop and set the brake before jumping down from the seat, not caring that she stumbled slightly in her haste. Thomas was walking toward her, covered head to toe in mud, his shirt soaked through with sweat and dirt, but he was grinning like he had just won a prize at the county fair. Without thinking, Helena threw her arms around him in gratitude, only realizing what she had done when she felt the solid warmth of his body against hers, and the rapid beating of his heart beneath her cheek. She pulled back quickly, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I am sorry, I should not have done that. Thank you. Thank you so much." Thomas's grin had faded into something softer, more contemplative, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. "No need to apologize," he said quietly. "I am glad I came along when I did." They stood there for a moment, neither quite knowing what to say, until Thomas cleared his throat and moved to untie his rope from her wagon. Helena watched his hands as he worked, noticing the calluses on his palms and the strength in his fingers, and she found herself wondering what those hands would feel like holding hers. The thought shocked her with its intimacy, and she quickly busied herself with checking on the mule to distract from the heat rising in her cheeks. "You said you are heading to Reading to start a new life," Thomas said as he coiled his rope and secured it back on his saddle. "Do you have work waiting for you there, or family?" "Neither," Helena admitted, reaching up to stroke the mule's nose. "But I have some training as an apothecary, and I am hoping I can find work in that capacity, or at least as a shop assistant until I can establish myself. My father left debts that consumed everything we had, so I am starting completely fresh." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and when Helena glanced at him, she found him watching her with that same thoughtful expression. "The town could use someone with medical knowledge," he said finally. "We have got a doctor, old Doc Morrison, but he is getting on in years and could probably use some help. The general store might have worked too, or one of the hotels. Reading is growing fast with the railroad coming through." "That is encouraging to hear," Helena said, feeling a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. "I was not sure what I would find when I arrived." "It is a good town, rough around the edges like most places out here, but good people for the most part," Thomas said. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internally before continuing. "Listen, I know we just met and I do not want to presume anything, but I meant what I said about making sure you get into town safely. The road can be dangerous for a woman traveling alone, especially as it gets toward evening. Would you mind if I rode alongside you the rest of the way?" Helena felt that strange flip in her stomach again, but this time it was accompanied by a warmth that spread through her chest like honey. "I would not mind at all," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "In fact, I would welcome the company." Thomas's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance, making him look younger and more boyish despite the mud covering him. "Good," he said. "Let me just wash some of this mud off in that creek up ahead, and then we can get moving. Reading is only about another hour if we keep a steady pace." They traveled together as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber. Thomas rode beside her wagon, keeping his horse at an easy walk that matched the mule's pace, and they talked as they went. Helena found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone, about her father's illness and death, about the shame of watching creditors strip their shop bare, about her fear and uncertainty regarding what lay ahead. Thomas listened with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel heard in a way she had not experienced in months, maybe years. In turn, he told her about his life on the Circle C ranch, how he had come to California from Texas 5 years ago after his parents died in a fever outbreak, how he had worked his way up from a green ranch hand to the foreman's right hand through hard work and determination. He spoke of the land with a love that was evident in every word, describing the way the mountains looked at sunrise, and how the cattle moved across the grasslands like a living river. Helena found herself drawn into his stories, captivated not just by what he said, but by the passion with which he said it. "You think you will always be a ranch hand?" she asked as they rounded a bend that revealed the first buildings of Reading in the distance. Thomas considered the question carefully, his eyes on the horizon. "I have been saving my wages," he said. "Someday, I would like to have my own spread, nothing too big, just enough to run a decent herd and maybe raise some horses. I am good with horses, but land is expensive and it will take time." "I think you will do it," Helena said with a certainty that surprised her. "You have the kind of determination that makes things happen." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Helena felt something pass between them that was almost tangible, like a thread being woven between two souls. "That means more coming from you than you might realize," Thomas said quietly. "You left everything behind to build something new. That takes more courage than anything I have done." They entered Reading as the sun was setting, the main street bustling with evening activity. Helena had heard that Reading was a small but growing town, and she could see evidence of that growth everywhere she looked. False-fronted buildings lined the wide dirt street, including a general store, a bank, 2 hotels, several saloons, a church, and various other establishments. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, men in work clothes and women in simple dresses, their faces reflecting the weariness that came with honest labor. Thomas guided her to one of the hotels, the Reading House, which he said was respectable and reasonably priced. He helped her secure a room for the week, paying for it himself despite her protests, insisting that she would need every penny she had until she found work. The hotel proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Patterson, looked at Helena's muddy dress and disheveled appearance with pursed lips, but said nothing when Thomas vouched for her character. By the time Helena's few belongings were unloaded, and the mule was settled in the hotel's small stable, full darkness had fallen. Thomas stood in the street beside his horse, his hat in his hands, looking reluctant to leave. Helena felt the same reluctance pulling at her heart, a strange sense that saying goodbye to this man would be harder than it should be given they had only known each other for a few hours. "I will come by tomorrow morning," Thomas said, turning his hat in his hands. "I can introduce you to Doc Morrison and help you get acquainted with the town if you would like." "I would like that very much," Helena said softly. Then, because something in her demanded honesty, she added, "Thank you for everything today, Thomas. You did not just pull my wagon out of the mud. You gave me hope when I was running dangerously low on it." Thomas stepped closer, near enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes even in the dim light from the hotel windows. "Helena," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she could not quite name. "When I saw you stuck there today, fighting to free that wagon all by yourself, something just clicked into place inside me. I know this is going to sound crazy because we just met, but let me unstick your heart too. Let me help you build this new life you are looking for. Not because you need saving, but because I think maybe we could build something together that would be better than anything either of us could build alone." Helena's breath caught in her throat, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were good tears, cleansing tears that washed away some of the grief and fear she had been carrying for so long. "That does not sound crazy," she whispered. "Or if it does, then I must be crazy too because I feel it as well, this connection between us." Thomas reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "Then we will figure this out together," he said, "one day at a time." He left then, riding back toward the Circle C ranch, but Helena stood in the street watching until his silhouette disappeared into the darkness. She touched her cheek where his hand had been and felt her heart beating strong and steady in her chest, unstuck and open in a way it had not been since her father's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she would not be facing them alone. The next morning arrived bright and clear, the storm that had created all that mud having passed during the night. Helena woke early, washed as best she could with the basin of water provided by the hotel, and put on her cleanest dress, a simple blue cotton that she had been saving for when she arrived in Reading. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up, examining herself critically in the small mirror. She looked tired. There were shadows under her brown eyes that spoke of worry and grief, but there was also something new, a spark of anticipation that had not been there before. Mrs. Patterson served her a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits in the hotel's small dining room, and Helena ate every bite, suddenly ravenous in a way she had not been for weeks. She was just finishing her coffee when she heard the sound of boots on the wooden floor and looked up to see Thomas walking toward her table. He had cleaned up and changed clothes, wearing dark pants and a light blue shirt that brought out the color of his eyes, and Helena's heart did that strange flip again at the sight of him. "Morning," he said, his whole face lighting up with a smile when he saw her. "I hope I am not too early." "Not at all," Helena said, standing and smoothing her skirts. "I have been up for hours. I am too excited about exploring the town and meeting people to sleep late." They left the hotel together, and Helena was immediately aware of the curious glances they received from people on the street. Thomas seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply accustomed to small-town gossip, but Helena felt self-conscious about the assumptions people might be making. As if sensing her discomfort, Thomas kept a respectful distance between them as they walked, though his hand occasionally brushed against hers in a way that seemed both accidental and entirely deliberate. Their first stop was Doc Morrison's office, a small building near the center of town with a sign hanging crookedly above the door. The doctor himself was exactly as Thomas had described him. An elderly man with white hair and kind eyes who moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints no longer cooperated as they once had. He listened attentively as Helena described her training, asking pointed questions that revealed a sharp mind despite his advanced years. "Your father taught you well," Doc Morrison said finally, leaning back in his chair. "I could certainly use help, especially with preparing medicines and attending to the women and children who often prefer a female touch. I cannot pay much, but I can offer you a percentage of the fees we collect and use of the small room in the back if you need a place to stay." Helena felt relief wash over her so strongly she nearly wept. "That is more than generous, Dr. Morrison. When can I start? How about right now?" the old doctor said with a chuckle. "I have got Mrs. Henderson coming in within the hour for her rheumatism treatment, and she will be thrilled to have another woman to complain to about her worthless husband." Helena laughed, a genuine sound of joy that felt rusty from disuse, and agreed immediately. Thomas squeezed her hand quickly before leaving to attend to his own work at the ranch, promising to return that evening to see how her first day had gone. Helena watched him leave through the window, already missing his presence, before turning her attention to learning the layout of Doc Morrison's office and the location of his medical supplies. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both strange and comforting. Helena worked alongside Doc Morrison, learning his methods and sharing her own knowledge, building a rapport with the townspeople who came seeking medical attention. She proved invaluable when dealing with the women and children, many of whom had avoided seeking treatment for minor ailments because they felt uncomfortable with the elderly male doctor. Word spread quickly that there was a woman with medical training working at the doctor's office, and soon Helena found herself treating everything from colic in babies to difficult pregnancies in women who had nowhere else to turn. Every evening, Thomas would appear at the doctor's office or the hotel, sometimes with flowers he had picked from the fields, sometimes with nothing but his smile and his stories about the day's work at the ranch. They would walk together through the town or sit on the porch of the Redding house, talking about everything and nothing, their connection deepening with each passing day. Thomas never pushed for more than she was ready to give, content to simply be in her presence, and Helena found herself falling for him slowly and inevitably, like a leaf drifting downstream. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Thomas took Helena to see the Circle C ranch where he worked. It was a sprawling operation with hundreds of head of cattle and dozens of horses. The main house, a large structure built of rough-hewn logs with a wide porch that overlooked the valley. The owner, Charles Callahan, was a gruff but fair man in his 50s who had built his empire through hard work and smart decisions. He greeted Helena warmly when Thomas introduced them, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "So you are the young lady who has got my foreman distracted," Charles said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Thomas here has not stopped talking about you since the day he pulled your wagon out of that mud." Helena felt her cheeks flush, but she met the older man's gaze steadily. "I hope his distraction has not affected his work, Mr. Callahan." "On the contrary," Charles said. "He has been working harder than ever like a man with something to prove. Come on, let me show you around the place." They spent the afternoon touring the ranch, Helena learning about the operation while Thomas explained the work with obvious pride. She could see how much he loved this life, the physical labor and the connection to the land. And she understood for the first time what he meant when he talked about wanting his own spread someday. This was not just a job for him. It was a calling, a way of life that shaped everything he was and wanted to be. As the sun began to set, Thomas took her to a spot on a hill overlooking the ranch, spreading a blanket on the grass so they could watch the sky turn colors. They sat close together, their shoulders touching, the warmth of his body a comfort against the cooling evening air. Helena leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling content in a way she had not felt since before her father's illness. "I have been thinking," Thomas said quietly, his arm coming around her shoulders to hold her closer, "about what I said that first night about building something together." Helena's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. "I have been thinking about it too." "I know it is soon," Thomas continued. "We have only known each other a few weeks, and by all rights, we should probably take more time. But Helena, every moment I spend with you feels right in a way nothing else ever has. You are strong and smart and kind, and when I look at you, I see the future I want for myself. I see a home and a family and a partnership built on respect and love." Helena sat up so she could look at him properly, her eyes searching his face. "What are you saying, Thomas?" He took both her hands in his, holding them gently but firmly. "I am saying that I love you, Helena Thornton. I am saying that I want to marry you if you will have me. I know I do not have much to offer right now, just a job and some savings and dreams for the future, but I promise you I will work every day to build the life you deserve." Tears were streaming down Helena's face, but she was smiling, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "You have already given me more than you know," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me friendship and kindness and laughter. You made me believe in myself again. So yes, Thomas Cooper, I will marry you because I love you too with everything I am." Thomas pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that took her breath away. It was her first kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more, a meeting of lips and souls that sealed the promise they had just made to each other. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Thomas rested his forehead against hers and laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the valley. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church on Main Street, with Doc Morrison giving Helena away and Charles Callahan standing up as Thomas's best man. The whole town seemed to turn out for the wedding, people Helena had treated in the doctor's office and folks from the ranch, all of them crowding into the little church to witness the union. Helena wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her alter from one she found at the general store, and she carried wildflowers that Thomas had picked that morning. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed her in front of everyone, and Helena heard several of the women sigh with romantic approval. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a two-room structure that Charles Callahan owned and offered to rent to them at a reduced rate. It was not much, just a bedroom and a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. But Helena worked to make it a home, hanging curtains she sewed herself and arranging their few possessions in ways that made the space feel cozy and welcoming. Thomas built her shelves for her medical books, and a table where she could prepare medicines when needed, understanding that her work was as important to her as his was to him. The first months of marriage were an adjustment as they learned to live together and navigate the daily challenges of building a life. Thomas continued working at the Circle C Ranch, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark during the busy seasons. Helena maintained her work with Doc Morrison, who had come to depend on her more and more as his health declined. They were both exhausted most evenings, but they always made time for each other, sitting together after dinner to talk about their days or simply holding each other in comfortable silence. Helena discovered that marriage involved compromises and conversations she had never anticipated. Thomas was used to living alone and had habits that sometimes frustrated her, like leaving his muddy boots by the door or forgetting to mention he would be late for dinner. Helena, for her part, had to learn to share her space and her decisions with another person, to consider someone else's needs and wants alongside her own. But they talked through their frustrations with honesty and humor, learning each other's boundaries and finding ways to meet in the middle. 6 months into their marriage, Doc Morrison suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to continue practicing medicine. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, while Helena was out making a house call to a family on the outskirts of town. She returned to find the doctor collapsed on the floor of his office, conscious but unable to speak clearly or move his right side. She immediately sent for Thomas and several other men, who helped move the doctor to his small house behind the office where his widowed sister could care for him. The loss of Doc Morrison's active involvement left Helena in a difficult position. She had the knowledge and skill to continue treating patients, but as a woman, she lacked the formal credentials that would give her authority in the eyes of some members of the community. The mayor and town council held a meeting to discuss the situation, and Helena attended, prepared to argue for her right to continue the work she had been doing alongside the doctor. Thomas came with her, standing quietly at the back of the room while she made her case. She spoke calmly and clearly, outlining her training and experience, presenting testimonials from women she had helped through difficult births and children she had treated for various ailments. She pointed out that the nearest other doctor was in the next county, over 30 miles away, and that the town needed someone with medical knowledge available for emergencies. The council debated for over an hour, some members arguing that it was improper for a woman to practice medicine without a male doctor's supervision, others acknowledging the practical reality that Helena was their best option. Finally, Charles Callahan, who served on the council, stood and addressed the room with his characteristic bluntness. "I have seen Mrs. Cooper work," he said. "She set my son's broken arm last month when he got thrown from a horse, and she did a better job than Doc Morrison could have done on his best day. My wife tells me half the women in this town would not have living children if it was not for Helena's skill with difficult births. Now I know some of you old-timers are uncomfortable with the idea of a lady doctor, but I suggest you get over it, because we need her, and she has proven herself capable. I move that we officially recognize Helena Cooper as the town's medical practitioner and pay her the same salary we were paying Doc Morrison. The motion carried by a narrow margin, and Helena felt Thomas's hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently in support and pride. She became, at 22 years old, the only woman in the county practicing medicine in any official capacity. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on her, but it was also deeply fulfilling, giving her life purpose and meaning beyond what she had imagined possible when she had left Sacramento with nothing but a wagon full of belongings and a heart full of grief. The years that followed were marked by hard work and steady growth, both for Helena and Thomas individually and for them as a couple. Thomas continued saving his wages, adding to them with money he made breaking and training horses on the side, a skill that proved increasingly valuable as more settlers moved into the area needing reliable mounts. Helena's practice grew as word of her competence spread to neighboring communities, and she began making regular trips to remote ranches and farms to treat patients who could not easily travel to town. They celebrated their second anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, and that night, Thomas presented Helena with a document he had been carrying around for days, waiting for the right moment. It was a deed to 160 acres of land about 10 miles west of Redding, near the Circle C Ranch. He had saved enough to make the down payment, and Charles Callahan had co-signed the loan for the remainder. "It is ours," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as Helena stared at the paper in disbelief. 160 acres to build our future on. It has got good water, decent grazing, and enough timber to build a house and barn. I know you love your work in town, and I am not asking you to give that up, but I thought maybe we could start building something that is just ours, something we can pass down to our children someday. Helena threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "Our children," she repeated, the words filling her with a longing so intense it was almost painful. They had been trying for a baby for over a year with no success, and Helena had begun to worry that perhaps she was barren, a cruel irony for a woman who helped other women bring children into the world. "However many or few we are blessed with," Thomas said, holding her close. "But yes, I hope we have children to fill that house and work that land and carry on after we are gone. Whether that happens or not, though, I want to build this with you, Helena. I want us to have something that is entirely ours." They broke ground on the new house that spring, Thomas working on it every spare moment he had while Helena continued her medical practice in town. Charles Callahan gave Thomas more flexible hours and occasionally sent ranch hands to help with the construction, speeding the process considerably. The house began to take shape, a solid structure of logs and stone with a wide porch and enough rooms to accommodate the family they hoped to have. Helena was treating a patient in town one hot July afternoon when she felt a sudden wave of dizziness and nausea that forced her to sit down quickly. Mrs. Chen, the Chinese woman whose daughter Helena was examining for a persistent cough, looked at her with concern and then with a knowing smile. "How long since your last monthly bleeding?" Mrs. Chen asked in her accented English. Helena had to think about it, counting back in her mind, and realized with a start that she had missed 2 cycles without really noticing, too busy with work and the excitement of the new house to pay attention. "About 2 months," she said slowly, her hand going to her still flat stomach. "Do you think?" "I think you should rest and eat ginger for the sickness," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "And I think you should tell your husband he will be a father by winter." Helena finished out her day in a daze, her mind reeling with the possibility. She had helped dozens of women through pregnancies, but she had never imagined how different it would feel to experience it herself. The mixture of joy and terror, and wonder that came with knowing a life was growing inside her. She said nothing to Thomas that evening, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes, but over the following week the signs became undeniable. The morning sickness, the tender breasts, the bone-deep fatigue that hit her in waves. She was pregnant. She told Thomas on a Sunday morning as they were riding out to check on the progress of the house. They had just crested a hill that overlooked their land when Helena reached over and took his hand, pulling him to a stop. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I have something to tell you." He must have read something in her expression because his face immediately filled with concern. "What is wrong? Are you sick?" In a manner of speaking, Helena said, a smile tugging at her lips despite her nervousness. "I am with child, Thomas. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, his expression frozen in shock. Then his face transformed, joy spreading across his features like sunrise, and he let out a whoop that startled both horses. He dismounted in one fluid motion and pulled Helena down into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests that he would make her dizzy. "A baby," he kept repeating, his hands cradling her face as he kissed her over and over. "We are going to have a baby. Helena, you have just made me the happiest man alive." They sat on that hill for an hour, making plans and dreaming about the future, Thomas's hand resting protectively on Helena's stomach, even though there was nothing yet to feel. He insisted on taking her home immediately to rest, suddenly convinced that she was made of glass and might break at any moment. And Helena had to gently remind him that pregnancy was not an illness, and that she intended to continue working as long as she safely could. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Helena found the experience of being the patient rather than the practitioner strange and somewhat unsettling. She understood intellectually what was happening to her body, but the emotional and physical reality was different from anything she had studied. Thomas became even more protective as her belly grew, finishing the house in a flurry of activity so they could move in before the baby arrived. Helena continued her medical practice through her 6th month, finally agreeing to limit her activities to office visits rather than traveling to distant ranches when the journey became too uncomfortable. They moved into the new house in early November, just as the first cold winds of winter began to blow down from the mountains. It was beautiful and solid, and everything they had dreamed of, with a large bedroom for them, 2 smaller rooms for children, and a separate room that could serve as Helena's office for patients who came to the ranch seeking treatment. Thomas had built her a large kitchen with a good stove and plenty of counter space, knowing how much time she spent preparing medicines and poultices. There was even a small barn for their horses, and the few head of cattle Thomas had purchased with his savings. Helena's labor began on a cold February night in 1876, 3 years after that first meeting on the muddy road. The pain started as a dull ache in her back that gradually intensified, and Helena knew with the certainty that came from having attended dozens of births that her time had come. Thomas rode through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Patterson, the 2 women Helena had asked to assist her, and then he paced the house like a caged animal while the women worked. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Helena had thought her medical knowledge would make the experience easier, but if anything, it made her more aware of everything that could go wrong, every potential complication that might arise. She gripped Mrs. Chen's hand and followed the older woman's instructions, pushing when told to push and breathing when told to breathe, her entire world narrowing to the primal struggle of bringing new life into existence. Thomas burst into the room at one point when Helena's screams became too much for him to bear from the other side of the door, and no one had the heart to send him away. He knelt beside the bed and held Helena's hand, his face pale but determined, whispering encouragement and love even as she crushed his fingers in her grip. Finally, as the sun was setting on that second day, Helena felt the baby slip free with a sensation that was equal parts relief and loss. There was a moment of terrifying silence, and then the room filled with the strong, angry cry of a newborn. Mrs. Chen held up the baby, still covered in blood and vernix, and announced with a broad smile, "A boy! You have a fine, healthy son." Thomas was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Patterson cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Helena's arms. Helena looked down at her son, at his tiny perfect features and the shock of dark hair on his head, and felt love unlike anything she had ever experienced crash over her like a wave. This was her child, hers and Thomas's, a piece of both of them made manifest. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her finger tracing the curve of his impossibly small hand. "Welcome to the world." They named him Daniel after Helena's father, with James as his middle name after Thomas's father. Little Daniel was a good baby, healthy and strong, though he tested his parents' endurance with his apparent conviction that sleep was optional during his first few months of life. Helena, despite her exhaustion, found herself marveling at every tiny milestone. His first smile, the way his eyes began to focus and follow movement, the strength with which he gripped her finger. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, often walking the floor with Daniel at night so Helena could rest, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until the baby finally settled. He built a cradle for their son with his own hands, carving their names and the date of Daniel's birth into the headboard, so there would be a record of this moment of perfect joy. Helena watched him with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing a tenderness in this rough cowboy that most people never got to witness. Helena returned to her medical practice when Daniel was 3 months old, though she limited her hours and brought the baby with her when possible. The townspeople were delighted to see the child, and Helena found that having a baby actually enhanced her credibility with the mothers who sought her help, as if having successfully navigated childbirth herself gave her authority she had previously lacked. Mrs. Chen often watched Daniel when Helena needed to make house calls, and a network of women in the community stepped forward to help in ways that made Helena realize how deeply she had become woven into the fabric of this town. The next few years passed in a blur of activity and growth. The ranch prospered as Thomas proved to have a gift not just for managing cattle and horses, but for understanding the land itself, knowing when to move the herds and how to maximize the grazing while preserving the grass for future seasons. Helena's medical practice continued to expand, and she began training 2 young women who wanted to learn healing arts, passing on the knowledge her father had given her. Daniel grew from a baby into a toddler and then a small boy, full of energy and curiosity, asking endless questions about everything he saw. When Daniel was 4 years old, Helena discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was too busy chasing after a rambunctious boy to worry as much. Thomas had expanded the house, adding another room and a larger kitchen, anticipating a growing family. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Rose, was born on a warm spring morning in 1880, her arrival far less dramatic than her brother's had been. She came quickly and efficiently, as if eager to join the family. And from the moment Helena held her, she knew this little girl was going to be different from her brother, quieter but with a will of iron beneath the surface. Daniel adored his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from changing her diapers to singing her to sleep. Helena watched her children together and felt a contentment so deep, it sometimes frightened her, as if having this much happiness meant something terrible must be waiting around the corner to balance the scales. But the years continued to unfold gently, marked by the ordinary challenges of family life rather than tragedy. By 1883, Thomas and Helena had been married for 9 years and had established themselves as pillars of the Reading community. The ranch was profitable enough that Thomas had been able to hire 2 hands to help with the work, allowing him more time with his family. Helena's medical practice had become so busy that she had officially taken on one of her students, a young woman named Emily who showed real aptitude for healing, as an assistant. Daniel was 7 and already showing signs of inheriting his father's love of horses and the land, while Sarah at 3 was revealing a stubborn independence that reminded Thomas of Helena. They were eating dinner one evening when Daniel asked a question that had apparently been weighing on his mind. "Papa, how did you and Mama meet?" Thomas glanced at Helena, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, son, it is a pretty good story actually. Your mama was stuck." "Stuck?" Daniel's eyes went wide with interest. "Stuck how?" "Her wagon wheels were buried deep in the mud on the road outside town," Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving Helena's face. "She was all alone, trying to push that wagon free by herself, stubborn and determined and not about to give up even though it was impossible." "What did you do?" Sarah asked, always eager to hear stories even if she did not fully understand them. "I helped push the wagon out," Thomas said. "And then I told your mama something that I had no business saying to a lady I had just met." "What did you say?" Daniel demanded. Helena smiled, remembering that moment with perfect clarity even after all these years. "He said, 'Let me unstick your heart too.'" "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, his face scrunched up in confusion. Thomas reached across the table and took Helena's hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her palm. "It means that sometimes people get stuck, not just their wagons but their whole lives. Your mama had been through some hard times and her heart was stuck in sadness and worry. I wanted to help her get unstuck to help her be happy again, and she let me, which was the best decision I ever made." "The best decision we both ever made," Helena corrected softly. "Because I was definitely stuck, in more ways than I realized. And your papa did not just pull my wagon free that day. He showed me that it was possible to build something new and good after everything seemed lost. He gave me hope and love and this beautiful life we have now." Daniel seemed satisfied with this answer, returning his attention to his dinner. But Sarah, with a child's unerring instinct for the emotional truth beneath the words, climbed down from her chair and walked over to hug both her parents, her small arms barely reaching around them. "I am glad Papa unstuck you, Mama," she said seriously. "Otherwise, we would not be here." That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Helena sat on their porch watching the stars, wrapped in a blanket against the cool spring air. Helena leaned against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and thought about how far they had come from that day on the muddy road. She had arrived in Reading with nothing, running from grief and debt and uncertainty, and Thomas had appeared like something out of a story, offering help when she needed it most. But what had developed between them was so much more than a rescue. They had built a partnership based on mutual respect and love, supporting each other's dreams and ambitions while creating something neither could have achieved alone. Thomas had his ranch, his land, his legacy to pass to his children. Helena had her medical practice, the satisfaction of saving lives and easing suffering, the respect of a community that had learned to value her skills regardless of her gender. Together, they had created a family, a home, a life rich with purpose and meaning. You ever regret it? Thomas asked quietly, his arms tightening around her. Marrying a cowboy and settling in a small town instead of going to a big city where you could have had more opportunities. Helena twisted in his arms so she could see his face, lit by the glow from the windows behind them. Never, she said firmly. Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I needed when I needed it most. You saw me, really saw me, and you loved me anyway. How could I ever regret that? I saw you, and I knew, Thomas said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. I knew you were the one I had been waiting for without even knowing I was waiting. That day with the wagon, when you jumped down and started digging in the mud with your bare hands, refusing to give up, I thought, that is a woman worth knowing, and every day since then has just proven me right. They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held 9 years of love and partnership and promise. When they finally pulled apart, Helena rested her forehead against his and smiled. Let me unstick your heart too, she repeated softly. That was the most romantic and ridiculous thing anyone has ever said to me. Thomas laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. I was nervous, and it was the first thing that came into my head. I almost did not say it because I thought you would think I was insane. I did think you were insane, Helena admitted, but I also thought you might be exactly what I needed, and I was right. Over the following years, the Cooper family continued to grow and prosper. Helena gave birth to 2 more children, twin boys born in 1885 who they named Matthew and Mark, completing their family of 6. The ranch expanded as Thomas purchased additional land, and the house grew with it, room by room, until it was one of the finest homes in the county. Daniel grew into a young man who combined his father's skill with horses and his mother's intelligence, already talking about taking over the ranch someday. Sarah revealed a talent for healing that delighted Helena, often accompanying her mother on visits to patients, and asking the kind of perceptive questions that suggested she might follow in Helena's footsteps. Doc Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1887, and the town held a memorial service that honored his decades of service to the community. Helena spoke at the service, acknowledging the debt she owed to the man who had given her a chance when she desperately needed one, who had taught her and trusted her, and ultimately made possible the life she now led. Thomas stood beside her, his hand in hers, a silent show of support that spoke volumes about the partnership they had built. By 1890, Redding had transformed from a small frontier town into a thriving community with schools and churches, paved streets and streetlights, all the markers of civilization pushing westward. Thomas and Helena were in their early 40s, their children ranging from Daniel at 17 down to the twins at 5, and they had become the kind of established couple that younger people looked to as an example of what marriage could be at its best. They celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. Charles Callahan, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, stood to make a toast, his voice carrying across the crowd. 17 years ago, I watched a muddy cowboy drag a young woman into my office and tell me he had just met his future wife, Charles said, his eyes twinkling with amusement as the crowd laughed. Thomas was supposed to be working that day, but instead, he spent hours helping a stranger get her wagon unstuck. I gave him hell for it, told him he needed to keep his mind on the job. But watching what these two have built together, seeing the family they have raised and the good they have done in this community, I have to admit I was wrong. Sometimes getting stuck is the best thing that can happen to you, especially if the right person comes along to help pull you free. The crowd applauded, and Helena felt tears welling in her eyes as Thomas pulled her close and kissed her in front of everyone, exactly as he had done at their wedding all those years ago. Their children groaned in embarrassment, but Helena could see the smiles on their faces, the security that came from being raised by parents who clearly loved each other and were not afraid to show it. As the party continued into the evening, Helena found a quiet moment to slip away to the porch, needing a moment to herself to process the overwhelming gratitude she felt for her life. Thomas found her there a few minutes later, handing her a cup of punch and settling beside her on the bench he had built when they first moved into this house. "You all right?" he asked, his arm going around her shoulders in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Better than all right," Helena said, leaning into his warmth. "I was just thinking about that day we met, how scared and lost I was, how certain I was that I had nothing left to offer the world. And now look at us. 4 beautiful children, a successful ranch, my medical practice, a community that we are part of. It is so much more than I ever dreamed possible when I was stuck in that mud thinking my life was over." "Your life was not over," Thomas said gently. "It was just stuck, waiting for the right push to get it moving again. And once it got moving, there was no stopping you. You did all of this, Helena. I just helped push." "We did all of this," Helena corrected, turning to look at him. "Together. That is the whole point. I could not have done any of it without you, and I do not think you would have done it the same way without me. We made each other better. We unstuck each other." Thomas smiled, that same warm smile that had captured her heart 17 years ago on a muddy road outside of town. "I am going to keep unsticking you for the rest of our lives," he promised. "Whenever you get stuck in doubt or fear or just the ordinary challenges of living, I will be right there to help push you free." "And I will do the same for you," Helena said. "That is what love is, I think. Not some grand romantic gesture, though those are nice too, but the everyday choice to help each other through the hard parts, to celebrate the good parts, to build something together that is bigger and better than anything either person could create alone." They sat together on that porch, watching their children play with the children of neighbors and friends, listening to the laughter and music drifting from inside the house, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. There would be more challenges ahead. That was inevitable. Losses and disappointments and the ordinary sorrows that accompany the passage of time. But they would face those challenges together, just as they had faced every obstacle since that first day when a cowboy stopped to help a stranger with a wagon stuck in the mud. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas pulled Helena to her feet and led her back into the house where their family and friends were waiting. They danced together in the candlelight, moving to music played on a fiddle by one of the ranch hands, and Helena felt young again, full of hope and possibility. She looked up at her husband, at the lines on his face that spoke of years spent working in the sun, at the love in his eyes that had never dimmed, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years continued to unfold, bringing changes both large and small. Daniel married a young woman named Catherine from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the Cooper property, beginning their own family while working alongside Thomas to manage the expanding ranch. Sarah, as Helena had suspected, followed her mother into medicine, attending a women's medical college in San Francisco, and returning to Reading to establish her own practice, allowing Helena to gradually reduce her workload. The twins proved to be handfuls, full of mischief and energy, keeping their parents young with their endless adventures and schemes. Thomas's hair turned gray at the temples, and Helena found lines around her eyes that had not been there before, but they aged together gracefully, their love deepening rather than fading with the passage of time. They still took evening walks together when weather permitted, still sat on their porch watching the sunset, still found moments to simply be together in the quiet spaces between the busyness of daily life. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned, Thomas and Helena celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, just the two of them while their younger children stayed with Daniel and Catherine. They were both in their early 50s now, grandparents several times over, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But when Thomas reached across the table to take Helena's hand, his touch still sent that familiar warmth through her chest, that sense of rightness that had been there from the very beginning. 26 years, Thomas mused, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Sometimes it feels like forever, and sometimes it feels like we just met yesterday. Both are true, Helena said softly. We have lived a lifetime together, but I still remember everything about that first day, the way you looked covered in mud, the kindness in your eyes. How you made me feel seen and valued when I felt invisible and worthless. You were never invisible or worthless, Thomas said firmly. You were magnificent, fighting to free that wagon all by yourself, refusing to give up even when it seemed impossible. That was when I knew. Knew what? That I was going to marry you, Thomas said simply. I did not know it in words right away, but I knew it in my bones. You were the one I had been looking for without knowing I was searching. Helena stood and walked around the table, settling herself in Thomas's lap the way she had done countless times over the years. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and they stayed that way for a long time, content in the silence and the warmth of each other's presence. Outside, the sun set over their land, casting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Helena thought about all the sunsets they had watched together, all the ordinary moments that had added up to an extraordinary life. Thank you, she whispered against his neck, for stopping that day, for helping me, for loving me, for giving me all of this. Thank you for letting me, Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. For taking a chance on a muddy cowboy with more dreams than sense, for building this life with me, for giving me everything I never knew I wanted. They stayed there until full darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, and when they finally went to bed, they held each other close. Two souls intertwined so deeply that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. They had been unstuck together, that day on the muddy road so many years ago, and in the unsticking they had found not just freedom but purpose, not just companionship but profound love. The years continued their relentless march, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. They lost friends to age and illness, watched their children grow and have children of their own, saw the world change in ways both wonderful and troubling. But through it all, Thomas and Helena remained constant, a fixed point in a spinning world, their love the foundation on which everything else was built. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep in the summer of 1908, at the age of 59. He had been working with the horses that day, doing what he loved, and he came inside tired but content, ate dinner with Helena, and never woke up the next morning. Helena held his hand as the sun rose, tears streaming down her face, grieving the loss of the man who had been her partner for 34 years. But even in her grief, She felt gratitude for the life they had shared, for every moment they had been given together. She lived for another 12 years, staying active in the community and in her grandchildren's lives, passing on stories of the early days in Reading and the love story that had begun with a wagon stuck in mud. She told them about their grandfather's kindness and strength, his dreams and his laughter, the way he had seen her when she felt invisible and loved her when she felt unlovable. She told them about the choice they had made to build something together, and how that choice had shaped everything that came after. Helena died in her sleep in 1920, at the age of 69, in the house Thomas had built for her with his own hands. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her in her final days, and she slipped away peacefully, her last words a whisper of Thomas's name. They buried her beside him on the hill overlooking the ranch, the same hill where he had proposed all those years ago, and the entire community turned out to honor the woman who had dedicated her life to healing and helping others. The Cooper Ranch continued for generations, passed down through Daniel's line, the house and land a testament to what Thomas and Helena had built together. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the California grasslands, people swore they could hear echoes of laughter and music, remnants of two souls who had found each other on a muddy road and chosen to create something beautiful together, something that endured long after they were gone. Their story became legend in Reading, told and retold with each generation. The tale of the cowboy who stopped to help a stranger and ended up finding his soulmate, the woman who was brave enough to accept help and wise enough to recognize love when it found her. It was a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances, that being stuck can be the beginning rather than the end, and that the right person appearing at the right moment can change everything. The wagon, the mud, the moment of connection that sparked between two strangers, all of it became part of the mythology of their love, a story that inspired countless others to believe in the possibility of finding something extraordinary in the midst of ordinary difficulty. Because Thomas and Helena had proven that love did not have to be complicated or dramatic to be profound, that it could begin with something as simple as a kind gesture and a willingness to be vulnerable, and that, when two people chose to build something together with patience and commitment and genuine affection, they could create a legacy that lasted far beyond their individual lives. Years turned into decades, and decades turned into a century, and still the story persisted. Great-grandchildren told their children about the ancestors who had founded the Cooper Ranch, who had helped build Reading from a frontier town into a thriving community, whose love story had become the standard against which all others were measured. The house stood firm, renovated and updated but retaining its essential character, a physical reminder of what Thomas had built for Helena. And on the hill where they were buried side by side, wildflowers grew thick and abundant, as if the land itself wanted to honor the two people who had loved it so well. In the end, Thomas and Helena's story was about more than just love, though love was certainly at its center. It was about resilience and hope, about the courage to accept help when needed and the generosity to offer it when possible. It was about building something meaningful from nothing, about partnership and respect, about the thousand small choices that add up to a life well lived. It was about a wagon stuck in mud, and a cowboy who stopped to help, and a woman who was brave enough to let him into her heart. And so their story endured, a beacon of light in the darkness, proof that even in the hardest times, even when everything seems lost, there is always the possibility of hope, the chance for connection, the potential for love to bloom in the most unexpected places. All it takes is a willingness to be vulnerable, a moment of kindness, and the courage to believe that maybe, just maybe, Being stuck is not the end of the story, but the beginning of something beautiful.